So we're going to start out our conversation in foreign policy with just a basic definitional issue, trying to figure out what the heck sort of falls within the scope of foreign policy. And I'm going to just offer a working definition. What I use to sort of think about what foreign policy is. Foreign policy is a complex process of formulating policies to advance a state's national interests in the world. And there's a couple things that are going on there. So one of the things at Flag is that we're talking about a state's policy toward the world. So it's outward looking. We have that differentiation between foreign policy and domestic policy. And we see that in the political science department here, where foreign policy is tackled in this class, and a lot of domestic policy is handled in Poli-Sci 432, which focuses almost exclusively on domestic policy issues. And there's a logic for that. The actors involved and the processes involved and the bureaucracies involved are very different from foreign policy versus a lot of domestic policy questions. Courts are less likely to weigh in on a whole host of foreign policy issues. So I think there are political differences as well, but there's also sort of a thematic difference in that we're interested in what's happening in the rest of the world. And there's sort of a reactive element of trying to respond to what other states are doing. So there's the outward looking policy piece. The other piece I'd flag is that it's a complex process. Then we talk about foreign policy, there's a tendency, and we'll talk about this at some length over the course of the semester, to think about states as unitary rational actors, that they are acting with a single mind, they have a single set of goals, and they're just sort of marching forward in a coherent and cognizant way, when in reality, when we sort of start digging into how states come up with policy, how they go about implementing policy, it turns out that that's a really complex process. And there's a lot of places where that can go wrong, or that can go be inefficient, or maybe produce unexpected or unanticipated outcomes. There's a third piece I want to flag in that definition, and that was the use of national interests with an S. National interest is sort of at the core of what we think about with foreign policy, but that's a really murky, muddy, amorphous kind of term. And I wanted to take a brief second to kind of unpack why national interest, which is at the core of almost every definition of foreign policy, is such a bad concept to work with. And so one thing I'd simply flag is that it lends itself towards sort of a tautology, right? Foreign policy is the pursuit of a state's national interest. Why did a state choose this particular outcome? It chose it because it's in its national interest. And that sort of response can be applied to just about every situation. When I think we can look at what states do and conclude that sometimes they do things that are counterproductive. Sometimes they do things that are terribly executed. Sometimes they do things that are just fundamentally out of touch with reality. And the idea that just sort of they had to do it because it's in the national interest misses a lot of that murkiness and sort of papers over it. And so I'd like to just flag that for us all, so we can be aware that while we're talking about this concept of national interest, what states want, in practice, that's not a guarantee that states are actually going to pursue that in their foreign policy. In addition, there's the problem of multiple national interests, that there can be many different goals that states are pursuing. Sometimes those goals are in conflict, right? And so oftentimes the classic example is that the United States has to choose between ensuring stability, which frequently means propping up dictators who are sort of known actors and who seem to be able to partner with the United States or help the U.S. achieve core strategic goals, versus democracy promotion, which might bring to power leaders that are democratically legitimate, something the United States claims to support, but who might not be as favorable to the United States, or might not be as reliable of partners in the short term, at least. So there's oftentimes a tension between foreign policy goals, and there's also not necessarily agreement on foreign policy. For a good chunk of U.S. history, or recent U.S. history, Republican and Democratic politicians and leaders who have sort of spearheaded foreign policy have more or less been on the same page, but I think that has sort of decoupled in recent years, both for sort of the elite level, but also for sort of mass public opinion. And so, depending upon who gets elected and who's in office, what the national interest is, how it's defined, how it's understood, can be very, very different. And in a sense, the national interest ends up being something that's rhetorical. Leaders are doing what they want to do, and they will justify what they're doing in terms of the national interest. And so, again, we have that term, it's central to our definition, but that doesn't make it a good term because it has all of this sort of additional baggage that's sort of mapped on top of it. There's also been a recognition that leaders don't always think through what is in the national interest. And one of the concerns that was expressed in the wake of Vietnam is that the United States had what it thought was a coherent grand strategy that led the United States down sort of a rabbit hole of conflict around the world. And the US was sort of retrenching after Vietnam, and Congress, through the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, tried to push presidents to be more conscious and forward-looking in planning what is the grand strategy for the United States. And grand strategy is sort of the linking up of what are a country's foreign policy goals, like what's your national interest, rhetorical as that might be. How are you going to go about getting there? What are the resources that you need to do that? And how do you make sure that all of that is sort of in alignment so that you can have the best chance of actually achieving your security and strategic objectives in terms of foreign policy? In practice, the Goldwater-Nichols Act gets presidents to do this by requiring that they put out a national security strategy document every 4 years. I think it usually comes out sort of at the end or the start of a president's end of their first year in office, start of their second year in office. That tends to be the cycle that we see. So we'll be talking more about this idea of national interest as the semester goes on, but I also want to flag that the concept of foreign policy itself also has sort of multiple different meanings in terms of how it can get used. Now, I kind of keep track of these myself by differentiating between the practical and the theoretical. So the practical is sort of the doing policy, right? So it's seeing possibilities and risks and benefits and sort of weighing those things and figuring out what's a good policy and figuring out how to get that actually implemented and carried out through the apparatus of the government. We'll be doing some of that stuff in this class with the intelligence analysis projects. We have a debate project, we have a policy brief project, and some of the case studies will focus on that as well. But there's also sort of the theoretical piece, which is how do we, as outside observers of foreign policy, how do we make sense of what states are doing? How do we explain what states do and why they do it? And that's a much more a theoretical kind of project, and we'll be doing that as well in this class through case studies and readings and some of the scholarly essays. So we've got both pieces of that foreign policy idea that are going to be at work in this class.